Welcome to your deep dive. Today, we're doing something a bit different. We're not just tracking market moves.
Oh,
We're actually cracking open a single, really influential document.
right.
It gives us an amazing high-altitude view of global economics, finance, geopolitics, all of it.
Yeah, it's a major annual letter to shareholders. Comes from a top U.S. bank CEO, and it was written right in the thick of it, just after all the turmoil of 2021.
Right, looking back at that year, but
Yeah,
really looking forward to.
exactly. And our mission here, well, it's to pull out the strategic thinking, isn't it? Not just crunch the numbers. This letter is key because it captures that exact moment, the post-pandemic recovery, all that stimulus money,
Mm.
crashing right into sudden high inflation, and boom, the war in Ukraine just changing everything overnight.
And the context is so important. The CEO writing this, they really stress that the impact on the world, the potential rejigging of the whole global order.
Yeah.
That's way more important than just the impact on the bank itself. It feels like they're trying to navigate this huge ship through, as they put it, challenges at every turn. You've got sanctions, inflation, supply chains just broken.
So we're going to focus on three big interconnected themes that jump out from this letter. First, this really unprecedented mix of economic forces all hitting at once.
Okay.
Second, something maybe less obvious, these big structural shifts that are kind of shrinking the role of public companies and traditional banks too.
Interesting.
And finally, there's this really strong call, quite politically pointed actually, for better American leadership and frankly, more competent policymaking.
Okay, let's unpack that first part then, the economic picture.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's full of contradictions, isn't it? Despite all the chaos, the U.S. economy itself was, well, surprisingly strong back then.
It was, and the letter points directly at the reason. Massive government intervention. Huge amounts. You're talking roughly $4.4 trillion in quantitative easing, QE.
Right, the Fed buying bonds.
And then another, $5 trillion in direct fiscal stimulus. Just enormous sums that stabilized markets and remarkably pushed unemployment down from that peak of 15% to under 4% in 20 months. Super fast.
Right.
And the U.S. consumer was key to this. The letter says, on average, the consumer was in excellent financial shape, which sounds maybe a bit surprising, but...
Yeah, given everything.
But they had built up over $2 trillion in extra savings during lockdowns. Leverage, so debt levels, were near historic lows. Mortgage standards had stayed pretty tight, unlike, say, 2008.
Okay.
And jobs were plentiful, wages were rising, consumer spending was already 12% above pre-COVID levels.
Hang on, if that strength was built on, $9.4 trillion of stimulus? Isn't that the very thing that creates the next problem? Wasn't that strong demand hitting those busted supply chains the fuel for the inflation fire?
That's exactly the tension. That's the core conflict the letter grapples with, because that strong stimulus-boosted recovery then slams into these three big opposing forces globally. You've got the momentum in the U.S., you've got soaring inflation that demands higher interest rates and means they have to reverse QE, start quantitative tightening, QT.
Pulling money out.
Exactly. And third, you have the war in Ukraine and the sanctions on Russia just throwing this huge geopolitical bomb into the mix.
Okay, that QE to QT switch.
Yeah.
That feels central. Can we just clarify that for everyone listening? What does that actually mean in practice?
Yeah, good point. So QE, quantitative easing, that's the central bank, injecting money, buying assets, pushing liquidity into the system. Think of it like turning on the taps.
Okay.
QT, quantitative tightening, is the opposite. They stop buying assets, maybe even sell some, letting bonds mature without reinvesting. It pulls liquidity out, drains the tub, if you like.
Right.
And the letter calls this a massive change in the flow of funds. It's not like previous rate hike cycles. The author really stresses that the interest rates needed to tame this inflation, especially with war and supply issues.
Yeah.
Well, they could end up significantly higher than the markets expect.
So the Fed's kind of flying blind. No old playbook for this situation.
Pretty much. Old models don't really work perfectly when you've got these unique supply shocks, sanctions, actual war impacting energy and food. It's a new ballgame.
And the war just instantly made things harder. I remember the forecasts. Then Russia's GDP expected to just plummet, right? The 12.5% drop predicted by mid-year.
Yeah, crater. But the ripple effects were immediate, especially for Europe, because they relied so heavily on Russian energy, oil, and gas. The GDP growth forecast got slashed, cut from maybe 4.5% down to around 2%. Big hit. And the U.S. wasn't immune either. Forecasts trimmed from 3% to 2.5%.
So the key thing here, the letter argues, is that geopolitics suddenly mattered again for the economy in the short term. which hadn't really been the case for decades.
Exactly. For maybe 50 years, big geopolitical events often didn't cause immediate, sharp economic disruption globally, but this did. It was more like the 1973 OPEC oil embargo shock. Suddenly, global politics is economics.
Okay, so the big picture is volatile, forcing central banks into uncharted territory. Let's pivot then. Inside the bank itself, how are these big, established players dealing with threats that aren't just economic but competitive? This idea about the shrinking role of traditional finance.
Right. It's a really interesting shift in focus in the letter. It does start by, giving banks props for their COVID response as they performed magnificently.
Okay.
And it cites JPMC's own numbers being the top PPP lender, helping small businesses, 400,000 loans, $40 billion, offering payment relief on millions of accounts. Big numbers.
Sure, but, isn't that kind of their job as a major bank in a crisis? Because right after that praise, the CEO dives into how the whole landscape is changing, how banks are actually losing ground.
Precisely. It's like, we did well, BUT. The ground is shifting beneath our feet. The data points are pretty stark, especially on competition from, shadow banks and non-bank players.
Like fintechs and big tech.
Exactly. Look at mortgages. Bank share of actually originating mortgages plummeted from over 90% historically down to just 32%. That's huge.
Wow. Where did it go?
Non-banks, specialist mortgage lenders. And then you have neobanks, the digital-only banks, now with 50 million plus users. And often, they can avoid some of the tougher regulations that traditional banks face, giving them an edge.
Like the Durbin Amendment on debit card fees.
That's one example, yeah. And meanwhile, you just look at the market value, the sheer size of big tech firms, Google, Amazon, Apple, and the growing fintech sector. They're pushing into payments, lending, data, directly competing.
Okay, and this connects to another point in the letter that really jumped out at me. This migration from public markets to private markets.
Yes, this is crucial.
The numbers are wild. U.S. public companies down from, 7,300 in the mid-90s to only 4,800 now.
Yeah, a big drop. But look at the other side. Private companies, specifically those backed by private equity, they've surged from around 1,600 up to over 10,000.
So why should you, listening at home, care about this shift?
Well, think about it. This trend means more and more economic activity, more wealth creation is happening away from the public stock market. It's in these less transparent, less regulated private markets.
Right.
So if the next big thing, the next Google or Amazon, stays private for much longer or maybe never goes public, your average investor, someone relying on their 401k or standard brokerage account,
They miss out.
they miss out on potentially huge growth phases. It raises real questions about access to investment opportunities for the general public versus, accredited investors and institutions who can play in those private markets.
So faced with this pincer movement regulation squeezing them in some areas, nimble tech competitors undercutting them in others, how does a giant like JPM fight back?
Scale and investment, basically. The letter highlights record revenue, $125 billion in 2021, and emphasizes they are pouring money back into the business, especially technology.
How much money are we talking?
For 2022, the plan was $15 billion just on tech. That's a huge number. And it's not just keeping the lights on, it's strategic bets.
Like AI.
Yep. They mention AI already saving them maybe $100 million a year just by catching fraud better. And they're pushing hard into blockchain digital currencies, using their own platforms like Link and JPM Coin, trying to build a tech moat, essentially, use their size to stay ahead.
Okay, that focus on internal investment to stay competitive.
Yeah.
That tees up the final section perfectly, doesn't it? The call for better national policy. Because the argument seems to be a company can invest billions, but it doesn't matter if the country itself isn't functioning well.
Exactly right. It shifts from the company's balance sheet to, sort of, America's national balance sheet. The letter makes a strong plea for better American leadership. It acknowledges the U.S. has flaws, calls out dysfunctional policies, inefficiency, but argues the core principles, rule of law, liberty, free enterprise, these are still exceptional ideals. They just need better execution.
So the argument is about regaining competence in governing.
Yes. Competence. It advocates for properly regulated free enterprise, explicitly rejecting both totally unrestrained capitalism and also crony capitalism, where rules favor insiders.
And it talks about the role of government.
Yeah, arguing government needs to focus on the things only government can really do effectively: national security, stable currency, central banking, and creating the conditions for private companies to create jobs, not trying to be the primary job creator itself.
Which leads into some pretty direct policy advice demanding bipartisan cooperation, which, let's be honest, feels rare.
It does. The letter basically says compromise is fundamental to democracy, and it's missing. Then it lays out what, in the author's view, both sides need to concede.
Okay, what's the message for Democrats, according to the letter?
It says Democrats need to acknowledge that fears of an overreaching Leviathan central government can be legitimate, and that, government action isn't always the best solution for every single problem, even if intentions are good.
And for Republicans?
Republicans, it argues, need to accept that America can afford a proper safety net for the elderly, the sick, the less fortunate, and that crucial government spending, particularly on things like infrastructure, might require higher taxes, including on the wealthy.
That's quite pointed.
It is. The rationale given is that if society and the economy improve overall from these investments, ultimately, higher earners benefit the most anyway. It's framed as pragmatic investment, not ideology.
And then there's the global angle again. That shock from the Ukraine war really brought home the need to rethink supply chains, didn't it, for national security?
Absolutely. A stark wake-up call. The letter stresses we just can't rely on countries with totally different, potentially opposing strategic interests for critical stuff, rare earth minerals, advanced semiconductors, 5G tech.
So reorganize trade.
Reorganize it, yeah, but rationally. Building stronger ties with allies, diversifying sources, not just, pulling up the drawbridge entirely, which could be disastrous. Do it thoughtfully.
Okay, and while all this big picture policy stuff is being discussed, the letter also points to things the company itself is doing on social issues.
Right. It connects the macro to the micro. Highlights their $30 billion commitment to help close the racial wealth gap. By the end of 2021, they'd apparently deployed or committed about $18 billion of that.
What kind of initiatives?
Things like financing more affordable housing, aiming for over 100,000 units funded, and providing coaching and support for minority-owned small businesses.
And what about climate? That's always a huge topic for banks.
Yeah, it gets a specific mention. There's a target to finance or facilitate $1 trillion by 2030 for climate action and sustainable development. But importantly, the letter pairs this with a strong call for energy security.
How so?
It calls for almost a Marshall Plan for energy, recognizing that while the green transition is essential long-term, the world still runs on hydrocarbons today. So we need investment in current energy supplies for stability, even as we invest massively in the transition. It's presented as a necessary balancing act. Avoid destabilizing things now while building for the future.
Okay, so wrapping this all up, what's the big takeaway for you to listen to this? It feels like this deep dive really shows the ground shifting under the entire financial system, doesn't it?
It really does. You've got central banks doing things they've never done before with QE and QT. You've got this huge flow of capital moving out of public markets into private hands. You've got tech disrupting everything.
And it underlines how tied a big institution like this is to, well, everything else.
Yeah.
The health of the communities it operates in, the competence of the government.
Yeah.
It's all connected.
Completely.
Yeah.
And maybe the most provocative thought comes near the end of the source material. It states very clearly, our most important asset, far more important than capital, is the quality of our people.
Okay.
Now, think about that. You connect that statement to the massive tech spending we talked about, $15 billion planned for 2022. But the firm also spends something like $39 billion a year on its people compensation, benefits, training, and they're even creating specific initiatives like this Morgan Health Unit aimed at improving healthcare for their own employees. So here's the question it leaves you with. In this incredibly fast, complex digital future for finance, what's the real competitive advantage? Is it purely about having the biggest scale and the fanciest AI and blockchain? Or, as that quote suggests, does it ultimately come down to the quality, the health, the loyalty, the skills of the actual human beings running the systems and making the decisions? Where's the real moat?
That's a great question to ponder. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into, well, the strategic thinking at the heart of global finance during a really turbulent time.
Yeah, fascinating stuff.
We hope these insights give you a valuable lens for looking at the world as it continues to change.